She signed her own name on a document that erased her. That's what they never tell you about power. It doesn't roar when it destroys you. It doesn't even raise its voice. It just slides a piece of paper across a desk in the middle of a thunderstorm, and the man you built your entire life around doesn't look you in the eyes when he does it. Kyle Dravenor, the Wolf King. The man who once pressed his mouth to her temple and told her she was the only quiet thing in a world that never stopped screaming. He handed her the divorce papers with steady hands. She took them with steady hands, too. That was the part nobody ever got to see. Stay with us. Because what happened next changed everything. Drop the name of your city in the comments, and let's ride this story out together. The storm had been building since noon. Serafina Valicrest, no, Serafina Dravenor, for exactly 47 more minutes, stood at the tall window of her private chamber and watched the sky over Vale's capital turn the color of a bruise. The clouds moved wrong, she'd noticed, not rolling in from the coast the way a natural storm should. They were stacking on top of each other, vertical, swollen with pressure that had nowhere left to go, like something massive had been holding its breath for too long and was finally about to break. She thought that was appropriate. 3 months. She had known for exactly 3 months. The morning sickness had started almost before she'd had time to process what it meant. The dry heaving into the copper basin, while Marais, her oldest handmaid, pretended to be very interested in the curtains. The fatigue that settled into her bones like wet concrete sometime around the 6th week. The strange, disorienting tenderness in her body that made even the silk of her court dresses feel like sandpaper against her skin. She had not told him. That wasn't a decision she'd made so much as a door she kept finding reasons not to walk through. Kyle worked before sunrise. He came to their shared dining table 3, maybe 4 times a week, and even then his attention was never fully present, his eyes tracking movements across the room, his mind clearly rehearsing campaigns or Senate floor arguments while his mouth made automatic conversation. She had tried, twice, to create the right moment. Once at dinner, when the candlelight was soft and the wine was good. Once in the early morning, when he'd paused in the doorway of their chamber, just long enough to look at her with something that almost resembled stillness. Both times, something had interrupted them. A courier. A general. The Empire, which had no interest in pausing its grinding machinery, so a duke and his wife could have a quiet conversation about the future. She told herself there would be time. The papers arrived 3 hours ago, hand-delivered by his secretary, a thin, colorless man named Breswick, who had the practiced neutrality of someone who'd delivered terrible news so many times it had stopped registering. He'd placed the sealed envelope on her writing desk, bowed with mechanical precision, and left without meeting her eyes. She hadn't opened it immediately. She'd sat with it for almost an hour, her hand resting on the wax seal, feeling the slight warmth the paper had retained from being carried against Breswick's body. Something in her already knew. The body always knows before the mind is willing to admit it. The seal broke with a sound like a small bone snapping. Formal. Legal. In the cold architectural language that Varamont's nobility used when it wanted to perform mercy while executing something. The grounds cited were a formal investigation into House Valicrest's potential involvement in correspondence with foreign enemies of the Empire. Pending investigation, it was in the best interest of the Dravenor name and the stability of the imperial seat to formally dissolve the union. Standard severance terms. A property settlement. An allowance. The allowance had nearly made her laugh out loud. She'd folded the papers back into the envelope, set it precisely in the center of her desk, and then sat very still for a long time. Outside, the storm had started stacking clouds. The door to her chamber opened at the 7th hour without a knock. Kyle Dravenor filled doorways. That wasn't metaphor. The man was built on a scale that seemed slightly excessive for the rooms he moved through, broad through the shoulders, his height requiring a habit of a slight forward tilt in lower-ceiling spaces. Tonight, he wore no ceremonial armor, just the dark functional clothes of a man who'd come from a working session, his sleeves rolled to the forearms, a fading bruise along his left jaw from the training yards that he hadn't bothered to have treated. His hair was shorter than it had been at their wedding 2 years ago. He kept it close-cropped now, almost severe. He looked, Serafina thought, like a man who had already decided something and was here to deliver the conclusion. "You read it," he said. Not a question. "I did." She didn't turn from the window. Behind her reflection in the glass, she could see his reflection too, large and still in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame. Then you understand the situation. Tell me what the situation is, Kyle. I want to hear it from you. He came into the room. His footsteps were heavy but controlled, a man who'd trained himself out of the carelessness of size. He stopped about 6 feet from her. She watched his reflection. Your uncle corresponded with Valdrin's foreign minister 4 months ago, he said. Letters were intercepted by the Third Bureau. The content was not favorable. My uncle is 71 years old and has been half-deaf since the Orath campaign. He corresponds with everyone. He corresponds with his late wife's portrait twice a week. The letters named specific troop deployments. She turned then, because she needed him to look at her face when she said the next thing. That's impossible. My uncle hasn't had access to troop deployments since he left the Senate floor 6 years ago. Something moved through Kyle's expression. Something that might have been, in a different kind of man, the beginning of doubt. But he was Kyle Dravenor, and he had been trained from boyhood to treat doubt as a tactical liability, and whatever that flash of uncertainty was, it went under before it broke the surface. The Bureau believes the access came through your family's historical Senate connections. The Bureau, Serafina said carefully, answers to Senator Halveth. The Bureau answers to the Empire, which is currently being run, in several important administrative respects, by Senator Halveth and his 3 closest allies who have been actively hostile to House Dravenor for the past 8 months. But by all means, let's trust their findings completely. His jaw tightened. She could see the muscle flex in his face from here. I can't ignore a formal accusation, Serafina. The optics alone, the optics, she repeated. The word tasted like metal. Your wife of 2 years, and you're talking to me about optics. I'm talking to you about the Empire. His voice had gone to that register she'd learned to recognize. Low, deliberate, the voice he used on Senate floors and campaign tents, stripped of everything personal. Dravenor has enemies on 6 different fronts right now. Military, political, economic. A whiff of treason ties around our house, and we lose 3 allied territories before spring. I can't... He stopped, pressed his lips together, started again. I cannot afford to look compromised. No. Her own voice surprised her, how steady it was. She had expected herself to be shaking by now. Instead, she felt a strange, precarious calm, like the eye of the storm building outside the glass. You can't afford to look compromised. That's what we've come to. Serafina, did you ask me? She took 1 step toward him. Did you come to me and ask me if it was true? Did you sit down across from me, look me in the eyes, and say, Serafina, I've heard this. Tell me what you know. Did you do that? Silence. Because I've been in this palace for 2 years, Kyle. I've been in every room you've let me into, and I've respected every room you've kept locked. I've sat through Senate dinners where half the men at the table were actively trying to undermine everything you've built, and I smiled and I was useful, and I never once put a foot wrong in service of this house, and you couldn't even come and ask me. It's not a question of what I believe, then what is it a question of? Her voice cracked on the last word, the first fracture in the steady surface, and she saw it land on him, saw his face do something complicated and painful at the sound of it. Tell me exactly what it's a question of, and make it make sense to me. Because from where I'm standing, you're telling me that my value to you was always conditional. That if someone who hates you decides to write my name on a piece of paper, that's sufficient. You don't investigate. You don't push back. You just end it, quietly, with an allowance. Thunder moved through the walls of the palace like the building itself had swallowed a growl. The investigation will conclude, he said. When House Valacrest is cleared, don't. She shook her head. The calm was still there, but it had changed quality. Not the absence of feeling anymore, but something denser, something that had been compressed by too much pressure for too long. Don't tell me this is temporary. Don't stand in my chamber with your divorce papers and your optics and try to make it sound like a logistical problem with a scheduled resolution. What do you want me to say? I want you to say the true thing. Just once, just in this room, say the actual true thing. For a moment, and she would think about this moment for years afterward, turning it over the way you turn a stone in your hand looking for the fault line. For a moment, she thought he was going to. His eyes held something undefended, something stripped of the strategic, imperial, carefully managed surface he wore like armor. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something. Then he looked away. I can't protect you from this if you're attached to this house, he said. The political voice again, smooth, final. The dissolution protects you too. Legally, you're removed from the investigation's scope. Serafina was quiet for 3 full seconds. There it is, she said. Sarah, no, don't. I heard what was under that. She moved past him to her writing desk, picked up the envelope, and took the papers out again. Her hands were still steady. She hated her hands a little bit for being so steady. You should know, before I sign this, you should know that I came to you with no conditions. I didn't come to this marriage looking for power or territory or a title. I came because I believed you were worth the effort of knowing. And I want you to understand in some part of yourself that you'll have to sit with later that that was true. It was always true. He said nothing. She took the pen from the desk. Outside, lightning split the sky over Vale's capital, and the thunder that followed was immediate and enormous, the storm finally releasing everything it had been holding. Rain hit the windows like thrown gravel. Serafina signed her name. She placed the pen back in its holder. She picked up the signed papers and held them out to him. He came forward and took them. His fingers were warm when they briefly touched hers in the exchange. She noticed that, the warmth of his hand against the backs of her fingers, because the body catalogs things that the mind is too proud to acknowledge. I'll be gone before sunrise, she said. I won't require an escort. He stood there, holding the papers. His face had gone somewhere she couldn't follow, somewhere behind the Wolf King's controlled exterior, and she couldn't tell anymore what was back there. Maybe nothing. Maybe more than she'd ever know. The allowance, he started. Keep it. She turned back to the window. Send it to the Soldiers' Widows Fund. I've been meaning to suggest that for a year. She heard him stand there for another moment. She heard him breathe. She heard him take one step toward her and then stop. She heard him leave. The door closed with a soft, definitive sound that was somehow worse than a slam. Serafina stood at the window and watched the lightning come down over the capital city, and she let herself feel exactly 1 minute of it, the whole weight of 2 years, the dinners and the small victories and the nights when he'd pulled her close in his sleep with the unconscious honesty that waking men couldn't manage. All of it. She let herself feel it hit her like the rain was hitting the glass, and then she straightened her spine and she started thinking about what she needed to take with her. Murray was at the door within 20 minutes because Merritt had been with her since she was 16 and had the instincts of a woman who'd spent decades quietly keeping catastrophe organized. I heard, Merritt said simply. She was a compact, gray-haired woman with a face like carved mahogany and eyes that had seen everything and filed it away without judgment. She carried a leather traveling case in each hand. You packed already. I've been packing since Breswick walked down this hall. Merritt set the cases on the bed and started moving with the focused efficiency of someone executing a plan they'd been quietly developing for months. The small carriage is in the east stable. Edon is driving. He's loyal to you, not to the house. We can be at the eastern gate by the 4th hour. The rain? Better. Less traffic. Less visibility. Merritt paused, turned, looked at her with eyes that had known her for most of her life. Serafina, the child. The word landed in the room like something dropped from a great height. Serafina turned from the window. She looked at the cases on the bed. She looked at Murray's face, which held no judgment, no panic, just the steady, pragmatic grief of a woman who understood that some situations required emotion to be handled later. He doesn't know, Serafina said. I know he doesn't know. Does he need to? She thought about the look on his face when he'd taken the papers, the warmth of his hand, the way he'd taken one step toward her and stopped. If I tell him now, she said slowly, it becomes a negotiation. He'll want the child regardless of everything else. He'll find reasons, political, dynastic, imperial reasons, why the child needs to be raised in this palace. And I will spend the next 20 years watching my son raised in the same ideology that just... She stopped. I won't do it. Not until I understand what's actually happening with Halveth and the Bureau. Not until I know if Kael is a man worth showing the truth to. Marette was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded once, the way she nodded at decisions that were painful and probably right. Coastal province, Serafina said. The Valcrest holdings at Caspian. Nobody at court thinks of Caspian. It's too far, too small, too nothing. I can manage there. You'll have the child in 4, maybe 5 months. Yes. Serafina looked down at her hands, the same hands that had just signed away everything. I know. She started moving. The next 2 hours were the most silent, most controlled work of her life. Marae had thought of everything, and traveling clothes, the liquid funds Serafina had kept in her own name in a banker's box under her personal signature, the correspondence from her own trusted contacts that she needed to take, and the correspondence that needed to burn. She burned it herself, standing over the fire grate, feeding letters to the flame one by one, watching the Empire's social obligations turn to ash. She did not take anything that had been given to her as Duchess Dravenor. The jewels, the formal dresses, the gifts from allied houses, all of it stayed exactly where it sat. She took her own books. She took the small portrait of her parents from before the war. She took a woolen coat she'd bought herself at a market in the lower city 3 seasons ago because she'd liked the color of it. She took Marae. At the 3rd hour, she stood in the doorway of her chamber and looked back at it for the last time. She had made this room into something. She had put books on shelves that had been bare when she arrived. She had replaced cold stone tiles near the fireplace with a carpet she'd chosen herself. She had grown herbs on the window ledge because she liked the smell of living things. She had tried, in 2 years of small accumulated efforts, to make this room feel like it belonged to a person rather than a position. It didn't belong to her anymore. She walked out and didn't look back again. The palace corridors at that hour were mostly empty. Skeleton staff, night guards at their posts, the vast machine of imperial administration asleep or pretending to be. Serafina moved through the familiar geometry of Dravenor Palace one last time, through the east corridor with its high ceilings and the sounds of rain against stone, past the portrait gallery with its generations of unsmiling Dravenor faces, past the war room whose door was closed, but whose light showed in the gap beneath. Kael, she knew, would be in there. He went to the war room the way other men went to drink. When the world felt out of control, he returned to maps. She slowed without meaning to. She stood outside the war room door for a breath. 2 breaths. The light was steady under the door, warm and orange, and she could hear something on the other side. Not voices, no one else was in there, just the sound of a man moving through a room he knew by heart. A boot heel on the stone floor, the scrape of a chair. She thought about knocking. She thought about saying, Kael, there's something I need to tell you. She thought about what his face would do. Then she thought about the papers and the steady hands and the optics, and she kept walking. The east stable smelled of straw and wet horse and the particular warm darkness that animals create against cold weather. Idon was waiting, a big-boned, quiet man of about 40, who had driven for Serafina since her first week at the palace and who communicated primarily through extremely subtle changes of expression. Tonight his expression said that he understood the situation completely and intended to ask no questions about it for the rest of his life. Caspienne, she told him. He nodded. He helped Marae load the cases. He handed Serafina up into the carriage with the steadiness of someone who understood that this was not a moment for tenderness or comment. The rain was coming down in solid sheets. The carriage moved out of the east stable yard through the service gate that Eden had already arranged to have open and into the pre-dawn streets of Vael's capital. The city was largely dark, the storm keeping even the night workers off the streets. They moved through the lower districts, through the merchant quarter, through the narrow arteries between the old residential towers, all of it blurring through rain-streaked carriage glass into a city that was becoming less and less hers with every street they crossed. Serafina kept her hands folded in her lap and watched it go. The eastern gate was staffed by 2 guards who were deeply invested in staying dry and who processed their papers with the brisk mechanical efficiency of men who wanted to be back under their overhang as quickly as possible. Serafina's papers, her original Valicrest papers, not the Dravenor documents she'd left behind, cleared without a pause. The gate opened. The carriage rolled through. On the other side, the road opened into the vast, rain-dark empire, the capital's lights already shrinking in the rear glass. The mountains to the northeast were invisible in the storm. The coastal roads ran south and east, and there were 700 miles between this gate and Caspienne, and every single one of them was hers to cross alone. She put one hand flat against the carriage wall, feeling the vibration of the wheels on the road, and she breathed deliberately through her nose for a long moment, and she said to herself in the same quiet internal voice that had been keeping her upright all night, "You know how to survive. You have always known how to survive. That's not a thing he ever gave you, and it's not a thing he can take. The child shifted, or she imagined it did. Something in her midsection, very small, very certain. She pulled her coat tighter and watched the empire she was leaving move past the glass. Somewhere behind her, at this exact moment, Kael Dravenor was sitting in his war room with the divorce papers signed and the fire burning low. And she wondered, not with longing, exactly, but with the complicated precision of a woman who knew a man's specific silences, she wondered what expression was on his face. She decided it didn't matter. The capital disappeared behind the rain. 3 weeks. That was how long it took for Kael Dravenor to feel the absence of his wife as something other than a political necessity. The first week was easy, in the way that any decision is easy in the immediate aftermath of making it. The certainty still fresh, the justification still orderly in his mind, the forward motion of consequence too loud to allow for second guessing. He buried himself in the Senate reports, the Bureau findings, the campaign logistics for the Eastern Territorial dispute that had been sitting unresolved on his desk for 2 months. He held 3 consecutive morning strategy sessions that ran past noon. He ate his meals in the war room and slept 4 hours a night, and by every metric that the empire measured the productivity of its dukes, he was performing at exceptional capacity. The second week, something changed in the texture of the days, and he couldn't locate what it was precisely. His chamber was the same, his schedule was the same. The war room, the Senate sessions, the council meetings, the generals and their maps, all of it exactly as it had been. But there was a quality to the silence in the palace that hadn't been there before, something he noticed in the same way you notice a sound has stopped. Not the sound itself, but the sudden absence of it marking itself against the air. The dining table bothered him. He sat at it alone and he couldn't explain why it felt different than it always had. Then he realized. For 2 years, even on the night Serafina hadn't been there, the table had held evidence of her. A book left open. A cup not yet cleared. The small, almost unconscious signature that a person leaves on a space they inhabit regularly. Now there was nothing. The staff had cleaned thoroughly. The table was exactly what it had been before she came. He had eaten his dinner alone and then gone to the war room and found, somewhat to his irritation, that he could not concentrate. The third week, Senator Halveth came to him with what he described as encouraging progress in the Valicrest investigation. He had brought 2 other senators with him, men whose names Kael had known for a decade. Institutional men, pillars of the old Senate, reliable in the way that stones embedded in a wall were reliable. They sat across from him in the formal receiving chamber, and Halveth laid out the case with the smooth expertise of a man who'd been preparing this particular performance for some time. Kael listened. He'd been listening to political presentations his entire life. He could do it in his sleep, track the argument's structure, identify where evidence was being substituted for assertion, locate the rhetorical pivot points where a sophisticated case was being built on foundations that wouldn't hold actual weight. He did it automatically, the way a man who'd grown up around horses automatically clocked a new animal's gait. He listened to Halveth's presentation on the Valicrest investigation, and he counted 7 such pivot points before the man was 3 minutes in. The intercepted correspondence, Kael said, cutting across the conclusion Halveth was building too. Where are the originals? Halveth blinked. The originals are in the Bureau's secured archive. I want to see them. A brief, careful pause. That's somewhat irregular given the sensitivity. I command the Bureau. Kael kept his voice level. Retrieve them. Another pause, longer. Something moving between the 3 men across the table, too fast and too practiced to be spontaneous. Of course, Halveth said. I'll have them sent to your office. The originals never arrived. 3 days of follow-up through Breswick, and each time there was a reason. A processing delay, a filing question, a senior bureau officer who needed to authorize the release. Each reason was plausible. Each reason, stacked on top of the last, formed a shape that Kael recognized from military campaigns, the shape of a defensive line being held. He pulled the one man on the bureau staff who'd served under his direct command before the administrative reorganization, a thin, nervous intelligence officer named Korvath who had survived in government by being reliably forgettable. They met in the East Garden at 6 in the morning. The Valicrest letters, Kael said. He didn't preface it. Are they real? Korvath spent approximately 4 seconds contemplating the philosophical question of whether his career was worth more than his conscience, and then he said, "No." The words sat between them in the cold morning air. "Tell me," Kyle said. Korvath told him. Not all of it. The man clearly didn't have all of it, but enough. The letters had been manufactured, produced by a Bureau scribe's workshop that Halveth had been running off book for 2 years. The deployment information contained in the letters had been real, which gave them texture and credibility, but it had come from existing Senate records that any member with the right committee access could retrieve. The fabrication was good enough to pass a standard review. It hadn't been designed to withstand the scrutiny of a duke who wanted to see the physical originals. "Why Valacrest?" Kyle asked. Korvath was quiet for a moment, then, "Because she was Dravenor. Because removing her removed a set of eyes inside this palace that weren't affiliated with the Senate bloc. Because—" he stopped, seemed to be weighing something. "Because there are people in the Senate, Lord Dravenor, who believe that your wife was the only reason you occasionally listened to counsel that wasn't military or tactical." Kyle stood very still. The morning was cold enough to see his breath. "Is there more?" he said. "More than the letters." "There's a great deal more," Korvath said quietly. "The letters were one piece. They were what you'd call a first move. Show me. If I show you what I think you're asking me about, I won't survive the month." Kale looked at him. "If you work for me, directly, under my household seal rather than the Bureau doesn't own what you know. Can you do that?" Another long pause. Then Korvath nodded, with the expression of a man who just made a decision he'd been too afraid to make for a long time. "Meet me at the palace archive at the 8th hour," he said. "Bring nobody from your current council staff." He walked away through the east garden and disappeared around the hedge line, and Kyle stood in the cold morning air and felt something that he hadn't felt since the early years of his military career. The specific, nauseating sensation of realizing that the terrain you'd been navigating confidently was not the terrain you'd thought it was. He thought about the signed papers. He thought about steady hands. He went back inside to prepare for the archive meeting, and somewhere under the controlled motion of a man with a plan, something was happening that he didn't yet have a name for. A pressure behind his sternum, a discomfort with a location he couldn't specify, an insistence from some part of him that wouldn't file itself under either military intelligence or strategic concern. It would be another week before he admitted to himself that he was afraid. Not of the Senate, not of Halveth, of what Seraphina's face had looked like when she'd said, "I want you to say the true thing." The archive meeting lasted 4 hours. By the end of it, Kyle had the rough shape of something that would take another month to fully document and verify. A systematic, years-long operation by Halveth's Senate bloc to position themselves as the administrative center of gravity in the Empire, quietly absorbing Bureau functions, judicial appointments, territorial governor positions, all while Kyle and his generals had been focused outward, on the borders, on the eastern disputes, on the visible military threats that were, Korvath suggested, somewhat deliberately maintained at a level of activity that kept Dravenor's attention pointed away from the capital's interior politics. It was elegant. Kale could appreciate the architecture of it, even as he was trying to figure out how to dismantle it. What he couldn't stop returning to, though, between the documents and the testimony and the careful analytical work that the situation required, was a simpler and more personal fact. Seraphina had told him. Not in so many words. But she had sat across from him in that chamber with the papers in her hand, and she had said Halveth's name, and she had said the Bureau answers to Halveth, and she had been showing him the thread he needed to pull, and he had wrapped himself in the imperial authority of his own certainty, and he had not pulled it. He had handed her the conclusion that Halveth had built for him, and he had delivered it to her with steady hands, and she had taken it from him the same way. He went to find Breswick. "Where is she?" he said. Breswick's face went through several things in quick succession. "The Duchess? The Lady Valcrest? My lord. She departed. I know when she departed. I'm asking where she went." "She didn't. There was no formal forwarding address provided. Her chambers were cleared within the day, and the carriage log from the east stable shows—" Breswick was already moving, pulling the logbook, running his finger down the columns. "Eastern Gate departure, 3rd hour before sunrise. The morning after the documents were finalized. Driver Edon Marsh, household temporary staff. He hasn't returned to palace employ. Valicrest Family Holdings, Kael said. He was thinking out loud, and he was aware that was something he almost never did. What properties does her family maintain? There are 3. The primary estate outside Darren, which is currently under a provisional administrative review, given the investigation status. There's a townhouse in Mirath that's been unoccupied for several years. And there's a coastal property in Caspian Province. Caspian. He turned the name over. A coastal province, far south and east, on the Empire's outer edge. He'd passed through it once, years ago, on a military transit route. He remembered small white buildings on cliffs and a harbor that smelled of salt and old nets and the particular quietness of a place too far from the capital to be worth anyone's attention. She went to Caspian, he said. He didn't know why he was certain. He just was. My lord, I have no confirmation. Have horses prepared. I'll ride in 2 days. After I meet with Corvath again and secure the first set of documents. 2 horses, no formal guard. A small party. Breswick's face now carried the particular expression of a man who had served the Wolf King for 6 years and understood that certain decisions, once made, were no longer in his area of influence. Yes, my lord, he said. Kael was already walking. He spent the next 2 days moving fast through everything that needed to be stabilized before he could leave the capital. The documentation Corvath had secured locked under his personal household seal, a quiet instruction to the 3 generals he trusted to maintain watch on Halveth's movements without alerting the Senate network, a coded letter to his brother in the Northern Territories. He moved with the focused, organized energy of a man who'd identified a mission objective. He told himself that was what this was. A mission to retrieve an asset. No, a person. To retrieve a person who had been wrongfully removed from her position on the basis of fabricated evidence, who deserved restitution and an explanation, and probably an apology that he was going to have to figure out how to deliver. He told himself that was what this was. On the night before he was scheduled to ride out, he walked through the east wing of the palace that had been Seraphina's domain, her chambers, the small study she'd used for her correspondence, the sitting room off the main corridor where she'd kept her books. He stood in the sitting room for a while. The shelves were empty. She'd taken the books. He hadn't known she'd done that. He'd assumed she'd left everything, taken only her personal travel items, as you would in a formal departure. But the shelves were empty, and he found himself looking at the rectangular shadows on the wooden shelves where her books had sat, the faint dust outlines of objects that had been there long enough to leave their mark. On the window ledge there were 4 small clay pots, herbs, dried out now, the stems brittle and gray. She'd grown them there. He remembered that, or rather he registered now that he'd registered it before without paying attention, the way you register the details of a room you spend time in without ever quite looking at them. She'd grown herbs because she liked the smell of living things, and she'd left in the middle of the night in a rainstorm without anyone to help her, without any protection, without any of the resources of the house whose name she'd been carrying, and she had been. He stopped that thought because where it was going was somewhere he wasn't ready to go. Not yet. Not in this room with the empty shelves and the dead herbs, and the night outside going very quiet now that the storm had finally moved on. He rode out at dawn. It took him 11 days. The roads south were manageable until the Cresswind crossing, where a bridge had been partially damaged by the storm, and the detour added 2 days through hill country. He pushed the horses hard in the flat stretches. He slept in provincial wayhouses and ate what was available, and he did not announce himself as Kael Dravenor of House Dravenor, because the last thing he needed was a formal provincial reception that would take up 3 days of dinners and speeches. He thought, in the long hours of riding, about the things Corvath had shown him. He thought about the texture of what Halveth's operation actually was. Not merely ambitious political maneuvering, but something more systematic. A patient reconstruction of imperial power architecture, built to benefit a specific class of old Senate families, at the expense of the territorial lords who'd done the actual work of holding the empire's edges together. The kind of thing that looked like normal institutional drift, until you assembled enough pieces to see the intentionality behind it. And he thought about the fact that Seraphina had seen it. He didn't know exactly when or how, but looking back at the last 6 months of their marriage with the clarity that distance and evidence provided, he could track it. The question she'd asked at dinner that he'd answered dismissively, The observations she'd made about bureau activity that he'd filed under the category of civilian perspective without operational context. She'd been watching the same thing he'd been missing, from the angle his position had made available to her. She'd been trying to show him. He'd told her the bureau answered to the Empire. The roads opened into coastal territory on the 10th day, the landscape changing from the inland hills' tawny rock and scrub into something greener and salt-worn, the vegetation low and wind-shaped. The sky at this latitude was a different quality of light, wider, somehow, without the mountains to contain it. The air tasted of the sea. On the 11th morning, he came down a cliff road and saw Caspienne below him. Small white buildings on the cliff edges, just as he remembered. A harbor visible at the southern end of the settlement, the boats in it scaled for fishing rather than trade. The roads were quiet at this hour. Laundry moved in the coastal wind between buildings. Someone was burning something somewhere, and the smoke moved horizontally in a long, clean line before the sea wind took it. He found Eden Marsh at the harbor, mending a fishing net with the concentrated attention of a man who'd decided to start over as a different kind of person. The driver looked up, saw him. A range of things crossed his face in quick succession. Recognition, wariness, and then something that settled into the still expression of someone who decided to let the situation develop before deciding what to do about it. "Lord Dravenor," Eden said. "I'm not here officially," Cale said. "I'm not here as Duke Dravenor. I just need to know she's all right." Eden was quiet for a long moment. "She's on the North Cliff," he finally said. "There's a house there, the Valcrest property. Small place. She walks to the cliff edge in the mornings." Cale stood there for a moment. "Does she—" He stopped. "Is she—" He stopped again. He was not a man who had difficulty finishing sentences. He found, standing at this harbor with the sea smell all around him, that he didn't know what the right question was. "Go see her," Eden said. Not unkindly. Cale rode north. The cliff path was narrow, and the wind came off the sea in long, cold sweeps. He dismounted halfway and left the horse at a fence post, continuing on foot. The path curved around a limestone outcrop, and he could see the house, small, white-walled, set back from the edge by maybe 40 feet, a garden started around the southern wall that was being slowly organized by someone who was figuring out the soil as they went. And there, at the cliff edge itself, with the sea spread out below and the morning light coming in low and flat from the east, Serafina, standing very still, her back to him, the wind pulling at her coat, and in her arms, wrapped against the cold in a white bundle that moved with slow, content breathing, a child. Cale's feet stopped moving before he told them to. His brain, which had carried him 11 days and through the organized logic of political betrayal and investigative evidence and carefully structured plans, his brain went completely and entirely blank. The bundle in her arms moved. A small fist appeared from the white wrapping, caught the morning light for a moment, curled and uncurled with the specific purposeless wonder of something brand new in the world. Serafina had not turned around yet. He stood there on the cliff path with the wind coming in off the sea, and he understood, in the way you understand the few truly irreversible things in life, that the 11 days of riding had brought him to a place he'd been approaching for years without knowing it, the exact edge of the person he'd been, looking down at the drop. The child made a small sound. Not quite language, not quite a cry, just presence announcing itself against the morning air. Serafina turned. Her face when she saw him was a sequence of things that happened too fast to catalog, and then settled into something very still and very careful, the expression of a woman who had been preparing for this moment and had decided in advance what she would and would not show. She looked at him across 30 feet of cliff path. Then she looked down at the child in her arms. Then she looked back up at him. And Kyle Dravenor, the Wolf King, who had never walked toward a thing he wasn't ready to face, found himself walking forward anyway. "How old?" he said. His voice came out in a register he didn't recognize. Serafina watched him come. 6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks. He did the math the way a military man does math, automatically, immediately. 6 weeks. Which meant she'd been. "When I signed the papers," he said. He heard his own voice say it, and he couldn't look away from the child's face, which was turned against Serafina's shoulder, and was... "Yes," Serafina said. He stopped 4 feet from her. The sea wind moved between them. "You didn't tell me," he said. Something moved through her eyes, not anger exactly, something that had been beyond anger long enough to cool into something else. "No." "When the papers arrived, when I came to your chamber, I know when." Her voice was quiet, but it had a quality like good steel, like something that had been tested to its limit and found out exactly how strong it was. "I know every single moment I could have told you. I decided not to." "Serafina, you didn't ask," she said. "You came to my chamber with the end of our marriage in your hand, and you told me about optics, and you told me about the Empire. And in the entire conversation, you never once asked me." The quietness in her voice didn't break, but it carried weight now, accumulated weight, the weight of 6 weeks alone on a cliff in Caspian, and the weeks before that on the road, and the night in the storm before that. "You never looked at me and asked if there was something I needed to tell you. You never looked at me like you thought I might be carrying something more than hurt feelings." He felt the truth of that land. He let it land. He didn't move away from it. "I know," he said. "So." She looked down at the child again. Something softened in her face for just that moment, something private and enormous that she didn't bother to hide while she was looking at her son. Then she looked back up at Kael. "You found me. You rode 11 days, I assume, given your route options. You're here. Now what?" The sea was loud below the cliff. A long way down, the white water moved against the rocks. From behind Kael, from the direction of the cliff path he'd just come from, a sound reached him. A sound that his training identified before his conscious mind did. The distinctive heavy scrape of boot leather on rock. From more than one person, moving with the careful, deliberate speed of people who did not want to be heard and were slightly too late. He turned. 3 men on the path behind him, dark clothes, no insignia. The particular posture of men who were not fishermen or farmers or anyone who belonged on this cliff path at this hour. And a 4th, appearing from the rocks to the east, and a 5th from the garden side of the cliff. Kael put himself between Serafina and what was coming, and the morning light caught the blades they were drawing, and below the cliff the sea moved with complete indifference to what was about to happen. Fiction disclaimer. All characters, events, and locations in this story are entirely fictional and created solely for artistic and entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real persons, living or deceased, or actual events is purely coincidental. This content is intended for mature audiences and is produced for creative storytelling purposes only. 5 men. Kael counted them in the half-second before his body committed to the geometry of the situation. 3 on the path behind, 1 from the rocks east, 1 from the garden side. A containment formation. Someone had mapped this cliff before sending these men here, which meant this wasn't opportunistic. This was planned, and it had been planned with knowledge of exactly where Serafina was. That information had to come from somewhere inside the capital. He filed that away and stopped thinking about it, because there was no room right now for anything except the next 4 seconds. "Get back from the edge," he said to Serafina. He didn't look at her. He was watching the 3 men on the path, tracking the one on the east rocks in his peripheral vision, calculating the garden side man's angle. "Kael, back, now." He heard her move, the sound of her feet on the limestone, stepping away from the cliff edge. The child made a small sound, not afraid, too young to understand fear, just responding to the sudden tension in the arms holding it. The 3 pathmen spread as they approached. Professional spacing, they'd done this before, or been trained by someone who had. The lead man was big, thick through the chest, carrying a short blade in his right hand with the relaxed grip of someone who'd used one. His 2 flanking men were younger, faster looking, keeping their blades lower. Kael was not armed the way he'd be armed on a campaign. He had a knife at his hip and the weight of 11 days of riding and the accumulated fatigue of the last month sitting in his muscles like silt. He also had 22 years of military experience and the specific, merciless clarity that arrives when a man who has been carrying guilt and grief for weeks suddenly has somewhere to put it. The lead man came in fast and direct, which was either confidence or impatience. Kael moved left instead of back, inside the blade's arc, and hit the man in the throat with the heel of his palm hard enough to feel the cartilage compress. The man's forward momentum became a problem for the man. He went down hard, both knees, hands at his own throat, and Kyle had already moved on to the right flanker who'd overcommitted to a thrust intended to catch him while the lead man was engaging. The knife went past his side. He let it. He got his hand on the man's wrist and redirected, kept redirecting, used the man's own extension against him until the shoulder joint reached its limit and went further than that. The sound was brief and specific. The left flanker was more careful. He stopped, reassessed, held his position, waiting for the East Rocks man to close the distance. Cale pulled his own knife. Stop. Serafina's voice. Clear, not panicked. Everyone paused the way people pause when a voice has a quality that suggests it has authority over the situation. Kyle glanced back without moving his body. She'd picked up a rock from the limestone cliff path, a decent size, the kind that would do significant damage, and she was holding it in her free hand with the child secured against her other shoulder, and she had placed herself at the garden-side man's approach angle, between him and Kyle's exposed back. The garden-side man had stopped. "You're one woman with a baby," he said. "I'm one woman with a baby on a cliff edge," she said, "and you're a man who needs to bring back a live report. Hurt either of us and see what you go home with." It was a bluff, partly. Kyle could hear the calculation in it, but it had teeth because the garden-side man couldn't afford to test it, and she'd read that correctly. Kyle used the 3 seconds she'd bought him. The East Rocks man had closed to 15 feet and was the real threat, experienced, watching rather than charging, looking for the clean opportunity. Kale took the fight to him before that opportunity arrived. He crossed the distance in 4 hard strides, got inside the man's guard before the blade could be positioned effectively, drove an elbow into the man's face, felt the impact travel up to his shoulder and register as done. The left flanker came then, because with the East Rocks man down there was no reason to wait. He was fast and he was smart, and he got Kale across the forearm with the blade before Kale got the knife into a position that ended the engagement. He stood in the middle of the cliff path. 4 men down. The garden-side man still on his feet, still watching Serafina, still doing the math. Kale turned to face him. The man looked at the 4 men on the ground. He looked at Kyle. He looked at the knife. He made a decision that was going to keep him alive today and ran, back through the garden path, toward the cliff road. Kale let him go. He needed someone to carry a message back to whoever sent this. He put his hands on his knees and breathed for a moment. The cut on his forearm was bleeding freely, not arterial, manageable. His shoulder ached from the elbow strike transmitting back. He was going to feel the 11 days of riding in about an hour. He straightened up and turned to Serafina. She was still standing with the rock in her hand. She looked at the men on the ground. She looked at Kyle. Then she looked down at the child, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder with the complete indifference to chaos that only the very young can manage. "Halveth," Kyle said. "Halveth," she confirmed. Her voice was steady, but her breathing wasn't. He could hear it, slightly too fast, the body's honest report on what had just happened regardless of what the face was doing. "You know about Halveth?" "I've known about Halveth for 8 months." She finally put the rock down. She adjusted the child against her shoulder with a deliberateness that said she needed a moment before continuing. "I've been trying to show you for 6 of them." He couldn't argue with that. He didn't try. "Come inside," she said. "Your arm needs binding." But the house was small and spare and nothing like Dravenor Palace, which was, Kyle understood within 30 seconds of crossing the threshold, entirely by design. There was nothing here that wasn't functional or personally chosen. A work table covered in papers, her own, he realized, correspondence and documents she'd been compiling, shelves with books that he recognized from her empty chambers, the herbs from her window ledge, repotted and slowly recovering on the new windowsill. She'd built something here. In 6 weeks, arriving alone and pregnant on a cliff above the sea, she'd built something that functioned as a life. He sat in the chair she indicated at the table. She handed the child to Marek, who had appeared from the back room with the expression of a woman who'd heard everything and intended to say nothing about any of it, and she went to work on his arm with the efficient, clinical attention of someone who'd learned basic field medicine at some point and was not going to make this moment tender. "The documents on the table," he said. "Bureau communications. Intercepted. Don't ask how. I have contacts from my father's Senate years that Halveth doesn't know exist. Correspondence between Halveth's block and 3 foreign ministry officials. And," she tied off the bandage with one firm pull, "a financial ledger. Partial, but enough. Halveth's been funding a private militia for 14 months. It's not a small force. Kale looked at the table, then at her. You've been running an intelligence operation from a cliff house in Caspian. I've been surviving, she said. Surviving required understanding what was hunting me. He heard what was underneath that. He was supposed to be the thing between her and what hunted her. He had instead handed her the door and watched her walk through it alone. Serafina. He said it and then stopped because there was too much behind it and he didn't have the language organized yet. She looked at him. The morning light through the window was reaching the table now, and he could see the 6 weeks in her face. Not age exactly, but something more specific. The particular quality of a person who has been carrying weight alone long enough that they've restructured themselves around it. The child's name, he said. Something moved through her expression. Aren't you going to argue first? Tell me I should have told you. Tell me I had no right to... What's his name? A pause. Kale, she said. Kale Eden Valicrest. He heard the surname. He let it sit. Valicrest, he said. He was born here, under my name, until I have reason to change that. I know. He looked at the bandage on his arm. I know why you did it that way. I'm not arguing it. She was quiet for a moment. He could hear Mare moving in the back room, the small sounds of the child being settled. What do you want, Kael? Her voice had dropped. Not soft. The opposite of soft, actually, stripped down to its functional core. You rode 11 days. You found me. You fought 5 men on a cliff to protect us, and I'm not. I see that. I see what it cost. But I need to know what you're here to do. Because if you're here to bring me back to the palace and call it resolved, I need you to understand that's not a conversation I'm going to have. The palace isn't safe right now anyway, he said. Halveth has too much infrastructure embedded in the capital. I can't bring you back until that's dismantled. That's not an answer. No. He looked up at her. It's not. He stood up from the chair. The cut pulled against the bandage. He moved to the table and looked at the documents she'd assembled. Not randomly, he could see now. Organized, dated, cross-referenced with notes in her small, dense handwriting in the margins. You have contacts in the Senate, he said. My father's generation. Old guard. They're not Halveth's people. They predate his entire network. I have Korvath. He's clean, and he has bureau access. Korvath. She said the name with the micro-recognition of someone who knew the name from documentation rather than personal contact. He signed off on 2 of the intercepted routing slips. He was following orders at that point, but he's not ideologically committed to Halveth. I couldn't tell from what I had whether he was afraid or complicit. Afraid, Kael said. He's working for me now, directly. She looked at the table between them, the documents, his hand near hers on the edge of the papers. This isn't a reconciliation, she said quietly. Whatever we're talking about right now, this isn't... I know what it isn't. He didn't move his hand. What it is right now is that Halveth just sent 5 men to a cliff in Caspian to deal with a woman he decided knew too much, which means either he's tracking my movements and knew I was coming here, or he was already planning to move on you and I happened to arrive at the same time. Both options were bad, for different reasons. There's a third option, Serafina said. He moved on me because of what I've been sending. The contacts I mentioned. I've been forwarding copies of this documentation. Someone in that chain may not be as clean as I thought. Kael looked at her. She looked back. There was a quality to this exchange that was nothing like their Senate dinners, nothing like the formal distance of the last months of their marriage. This was 2 people who were both looking at the same problem from positions that were closer than either of them had intended to occupy. Who received your last transmission? He said. Lord Adden Vaith, my father's oldest ally in the Eastern Coalition. Vaith's son sits on Halveth's judicial committee. The silence that followed had weight. He played me, Serafina said. Not loud, not performed, just the flat recognition of someone absorbing a betrayal that had real consequences. Or Vaith is being watched, and his communications are being intercepted. Either way, Halveth has your location and knows what you've been building here. Kael moved to the window, looked out at the cliff path. The men were still where he'd left them, 2 of them moving now, getting themselves upright, the fight going out of them, and the survival instinct taking over. They'd be gone within the hour. We have maybe a day before he sends a larger party. Then what? Then we move. Not back to the capital. Not yet. I have a contact in Aldenmere, 2 days north, who owes me a substantial debt and has a secured compound off the main routes. We consolidate there, I bring Corvath in, and we start building a case that can be presented publicly before Halveth has the infrastructure to suppress it. We, Serafina said. He looked at her. You said we, she said. You should be careful with that word. It's doing a lot of work right now without much foundation under it. I know. You handed me divorce papers in a thunderstorm. You chose optics. I know. You never asked. Her voice was still controlled, still precise, but there was something working underneath it now, something that all the weeks on the cliff and all the pragmatic survival architecture hadn't entirely compressed. You never once asked. I was 3 months along, and I sat across from you, and I kept waiting for you to ask, and you never— Serafina. He crossed the room. He stopped close enough that he was in the space that required a conscious decision to enter. He didn't touch her. I know every single thing you just said. I know. I'm not here to argue it or explain it away or give you a list of reasons why I made the calls I made. I'm here because I was wrong, and because there are 5 men on a cliff outside who I'm going to have to answer to, whoever sent them, and because there's a child in the next room with my jaw in your eyes, and I looked at him for 4 seconds before those men came, and I can't— He stopped. He pressed his lips together. His jaw worked once. I can't undo what I did, he said. I know that. I'm asking you for the chance to do what comes next better than I did what came before. The morning light moved between them. In the back room, the child made a sound, a small, purposeful sound, the particular announcement of someone waking up and registering an opinion about it. Serafina looked at Kael for a long moment. Her eyes were doing something complicated and private that she wasn't trying to hide but wasn't offering as a signal either. Pack what matters, she said finally. We leave at noon. She went to the back room. Kael stood in the middle of the small house in Caspian and breathed for a moment, feeling the cut in his arm and the 11 days of riding and the specific bone-level exhaustion of a man who has been carrying certainty as a weapon and has just set it down. He picked up the documents from the table and started reading. But they left at noon, as she'd said, Eden driving a covered cart with the horses tied behind, Murray in the back with supplies, and the child, Kael and Serafina, on the bench. They didn't speak for the first hour. The cliff road became a coastal highway, which became an inland route when Serafina noted that the coastal way was too visible. She knew these roads better than he did. She'd been living on them for weeks, learning the province the way you learn any territory you're depending on for your life. He noticed that. He filed it without comment. The silence wasn't the silence they'd had at the end of their marriage, the silence of 2 people maintaining careful distance across a table. This was different. Working silence. The silence of a shared problem being processed in parallel. Vaithi's son, Serafina said. The first words in an hour. Mareth Vaithi. Been on Halveth's judicial committee 14 months. That's when I started sending to his father. Then Halveth turned Mareth specifically to intercept your network. He knew you were working from the Valicrest contacts. Kael watched the road. He's been more patient than I gave him credit for. He's been patient for 3 years, Serafina said. The Dravenor alliance with the Eastern Territories was the last significant obstacle to his bloc's administrative dominance. Your military reputation kept the territorial lords loyal to you instead of to the Senate, so he couldn't move against you directly. He needed to isolate you first. Reduce your credibility with the allied houses. Remove your domestic information sources. She paused. I was a domestic information source. Kael turned to look at her. You were running me, he said. Not an accusation. Something more like recognition. I was keeping you informed, she said carefully. There's a difference. From inside the palace. From inside the palace, yes. Halveth understood that better than you did, apparently. He turned back to the road. He felt, under the strategic analysis, something that was neither comfortable nor simple, the outline of how much had been happening in his own house that he'd been too focused outward to see. Serafina, patient and precise, reading the Senate floor with her father's trained eye, building a picture he'd never asked to see because he'd already decided the picture he had was complete. He'd wasted her, not maliciously. That almost made it worse. The sheer, preventable waste of it, the way his own certainty had been used against him. In Aldenmere, he said, when we're secured, I want everything you have, not just the documents. Everything you understand about the network. She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted. Not quite trust, but the thing that happens right before trust, the moment when a person decides whether the offer is real or tactical. Why? She said. Because you've been right about this since before I destroyed our marriage over a fabricated letter, and I'd like to stop being the last person in the room to understand what's happening. The cart moved through the inland road. The sun was dropping west, pulling long shadows from the scrub trees. I'll tell you everything, she said. 3 miles later, she said, Chal Kael. Yeah. Aldenmere. Your contact there. A pause, short but deliberate. Is it Ren Aldrich? He looked at her. Yes, he said slowly. Ren Aldrich has been in correspondence with Halveth's senior legal officer for the past 4 months. Her voice was completely even. I have the routing confirmation in the second document bundle. 3rd page. The cartwheels turned on the road. Kael felt the weight of what she'd just said settle into the space between his shoulder blades like something with a blade at the end of it. Aldenmere was 2 days away, and the only other secured contact he had north of the capital was a man he hadn't fully vetted in 3 years, which meant every route he'd been mentally mapping for the last 11 days had just folded, and they were moving through open territory with a cart and a child and a woman who had been hunted once already today. And Halveth's network ran deeper and wider than anything Corvath had shown him. And the 5 men on the cliff had been a message, but Kael was only now reading what the message actually said. It said, I have been inside your world for years. I know your safe houses. I know your contacts. I know where you run. He picked up the reins harder than he needed to and said nothing for a long time, thinking. Because the thing about being surrounded on all sides by an enemy you underestimated is that retreat isn't a strategy anymore. Retreat is just dying slower. And Kael Dravenor had never in his life been built for dying slower. He'd got fiction disclaimer. All characters, events, and locations in this story are entirely fictional and created solely for artistic and entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real persons, living or deceased, or actual events is purely coincidental. Kyle said nothing for 3 miles. Serafina let him have the silence because she recognized it. The specific, compressed quality of a man rebuilding a map from scratch, tearing out everything he'd marked as reliable and starting over with what actually held. She'd lived in that silence herself, on the road from the capital, 6 weeks ago. She knew how long it took, and she knew interrupting it didn't help. The cart moved through the scrub tree shadows. Eden drove without looking back. How certain are you? Kael said finally. The routing confirmation shows Aldrich's household seal on the receipt acknowledgement. It's not a copy. It's not secondhand. Halveth's legal officer sent 3 separate communications over 4 months, and Aldrich received and acknowledged all 3. She paused. I'm certain. Aldrich has known me for 12 years. I know. He was at my father's funeral. I know, Kael. He let out a breath that wasn't quite a sound. Something working through him that he was keeping controlled by force of practice, the way a man who's been in enough bad situations learns to process catastrophic information without letting the processing show on the outside. But she was sitting close enough to feel the slight change in how he held himself, something tighter through the shoulders, something that had nothing to do with posture and everything to do with the particular weight of a betrayal that comes from a direction you never armored yourself against. 12 years. A funeral. The texture of what that meant. Who else? He said. Of your contacts specifically, I can only confirm Aldrich from what I have. But Halveth's network doesn't work by converting individuals randomly. He works institutional seams. He finds the people who feel passed over, underpaid, overlooked by the Dravenor Alliance, and he offers them something that feels like correction. Aldrich lost the Northern Trade contract 3 years ago when you restructured the provincial agreements. He told me he understood the reasoning. Men tell you what you want to hear when you hold the contract. Kael's jaw was working. Not anger yet. Something prior to anger, the cold place before it. Corvath, he said. Corvath I trust based on what I've seen. He's afraid, not converted. There's a difference in the documentation patterns. Converted assets produce clean, useful information on schedule. Afraid ones leak in fragments irregularly because they're managing their own risk. Corvath's the second type. He looked at her. Something in his expression that wasn't quite what she expected. Not pride, not the particular male discomfort of being outmaneuvered by someone he'd underestimated. Something more direct than that. Something that was struggling with itself. "Where do we go?" he said. "There's a mill town called Vess, 12 miles east of where we are. I've never contacted anyone from there, and it's not connected to any Valcrest holdings. We stop there tonight and reassess in the morning." "You've already thought this through." "I had 6 weeks on a cliff with nothing but documents and time," she said. "I've been thinking through contingencies since the first week." He nodded once, turned forward. "Vess," Adon had heard. The cart shifted direction at the next fork, Asen. Vess was exactly what Serafina had hoped for. A working mill town with no strategic value and no reason for anyone from the capital to be watching it. They took 2 rooms above a grain merchant's storehouse, the kind of anonymous accommodation that costs little and asked nothing. The merchant's wife looked at the infant and the traveling party with the incurious practicality of a woman who'd housed stranger things. Mare settled the child in the back room. Kael spread the documents on the small table under the oil lamp. He read for 2 hours without speaking. Serafina sat across from him and watched him read, and she watched the particular sequence of expressions that moved through his face when he reached each new section: the bureau communications, the financial ledger, the correspondence chain. She'd read all of it weeks ago, and it had still been like being hit with something heavy. Watching him encounter it now, she understood he was doing the same internal restructuring she had done, but with the additional weight of recognizing his own name in the architecture of what had been built around him. "The civil administration appointments," he said. It wasn't a question. "Halveth controls 7 of the 11 provincial governors directly. The other 4 are either neutral or compromised in ways that would prevent them from acting against him even if they wanted to. The judiciary, majority, enough to control any formal proceedings against the bloc. The military command structure. That's the one area he hasn't penetrated completely. Your generals are loyal, but 3 of your senior logistics officers have ties to Halveth's funding network." She tapped a page near his hand. "Page 8. He found it, read it. His face did something that was almost nothing, which meant it was doing a great deal. "He's been building a state inside the state," Kael said. "For 3 years. Longer in the planning stages, probably. You were the obstacle he couldn't remove directly. Your military reputation was too embedded in the territorial lord's loyalty. So he built around you. When the structure was complete enough, he needed one coordinated move to isolate you. Remove your domestic intelligence. Fracture your house. Give the allied lords a reason to question your judgment." He heard her pause. The Valacrest accusation was designed to do all 3 simultaneously. Kael was quiet for a moment. The oil lamp moved in a draft from the window. "And he miscalculated one thing," he said. "He didn't account for what I'd do with the information I had," she said. "He thought removing me from the palace removed the problem. He didn't understand that the problem was already documented." Kael looked across the table at her. The lamplight was doing what lamplight does to faces in small rooms, stripping away the managed surface, finding what was underneath. He looked, Serafina thought, like a man who was seeing something clearly for the first time in a long time, and finding the clarity uncomfortable in the specific way that real things are uncomfortable when you've been living with a cleaner version. "When I came to your chamber that night," he said. She held his gaze. "Don't. I need to." "You don't. Not tonight." Her voice was level. "Tonight we figure out how to survive the week. The rest of it, the accounting. That's not going anywhere. We can do that when there aren't hired men between us and the road." He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he nodded and looked back at the documents. They worked until past midnight. The knock came at the 3rd hour, well before dawn. 4 sharp raps, the pattern Korvath had been told to use if contact was necessary before the scheduled meeting. Kael was on his feet and at the door before the 4th knock finished. Korvath looked like a man who had ridden very hard and very scared. His horse had probably been pushed beyond good sense. He had dust on him from 3 provinces, and the expression of someone who'd been rehearsing what he was about to say for the entire journey and still wasn't sure it was going to come out right. "How did you find this location?" Kael said. "I didn't." Korvath's voice was rough with road dust. "I followed the cart from Caspian. I've been behind you since the coast." "You were in Caspian. I came to warn you. I was 2 hours behind the 5 men Halveth sent." He looked past Kael to where Serafina stood at the table. I see you managed. Tell me why you're here, Kyle said. Korvath looked back at him. His eyes had the specific quality of a man who's been afraid for a long time and has reached the point where the fear has used itself up and what's left underneath is something cleaner and more dangerous. Breswick, he said. The name landed in the room. Cale's face went still in a way that Seraphina had never seen before. Not the controlled stillness of the public duke, but something more fundamental, like a building discovering a crack in its foundation wall. Say that again, he said. Breswick has been Halveth's inside man for 4 years. Longer, possibly. 4 years is what I can document. Korvath pulled a folded set of papers from inside his coat. He's the routing point for everything that moves in and out of Dravenor Palace administratively. Every communication you've sent through official channels for 4 years has been reviewed by Halveth's people before it reached its destination. Every visitor log, every document request, every internal dispatch. He held the papers out. He's also the one who confirmed your route toward Aldenmere to Halveth's people 48 hours ago, before you'd even left the capital. Kyle did not take the papers immediately. He stood very still, and Seraphina watched him process it, the full scope of what Korvath had just said. Breswick, the thin, colorless man who had delivered the divorce papers to her chamber with his mechanical bow and his averted eyes. The man who had been in that palace longer than she had, who had access to every room, who had organized every schedule and logged every arrival and processed every piece of paper that moved through the Duke's household for years. She thought about Breswick handing her the envelope, the precise placement on her writing desk, the bow. She thought about how long that envelope had been in his possession before it reached her. Breswick told me, Kael said. His voice was very quiet. About Aldrich's loyalty. He said Aldrich was clean. He confirmed it specifically when I asked, 2 months ago. Yes, Korvath said. A long moment. He told me Aldrich was clean because he needed me to run to Aldrich, Kael said. And then he confirmed my route so that Halveth's people would be waiting there. Yes. And he's been in my household for as long as any of us can confirm. The documentation I have starts at 4 years. It may go further back. Korvath set the papers on the table. Lord Dravenor, I need you to understand what I'm telling you. This isn't a breach in your outer circle. Breswick has been the administrative center of your household operation. There is almost nothing that has moved through Dravenor Palace in the last 4 years that Halveth doesn't know. The oil lamp guttered in its draft. Kael turned away from both of them. He went to the window that looked out over the dark mill town, and he stood with his back to the room, and the set of his shoulders was something that Seraphina read without difficulty. The physical language of a man encountering the limit of what he'd built his identity on. He had believed, at his core, that he knew his world. He had believed that the clarity of his judgment, the rigor of his decisions, the hard work of 22 years of military and political discipline, he had believed these things constituted a defense, a real one. That a man who was sufficiently capable, sufficiently alert, sufficiently thorough, could not be hollowed out from the inside while he was looking outward. Breswick had been with him longer than Seraphina, longer than most of his generals. He delivered the papers, Seraphina said quietly. She wasn't directing it at anyone, she was just saying it into the room because it needed to be said. He brought them to you, Kael said, without turning around. He put them in your hands. He probably wrote the final draft. Kael's hands, flat against the window frame, pressed harder against the wood. She could see the tendons in his forearms shift. Where is he now? Kael said. In the palace, Korvath said, running your household in your absence, with full access to every communication you've sent from the road. What's he told Halveth about my current location? Based on the timing, he knows you turned away from Aldenmere. He doesn't know about Vest specifically, I believe, because I was close enough to your cart to see no one was following you from the main road. But he knows you're somewhere in the interior provinces. He knows you have the documents, and he knows... Korvath hesitated. Say it, Kael said. He knows about the child. He's the one who logged the timing of Lady Valicrest's departure from the palace. He did the math the same way anyone would. Halveth knows. The room was very quiet. Seraphina looked at the backroom door, behind which Maret and the child were sleeping. Something moved through her that she recognized as fear, but which arrived in a cold, functional form rather than a paralyzing one. The kind of fear that doesn't freeze you, but instead reorganizes everything instantly around a single clear priority. She stood up. Then we're not secure here, she said. No, Korvath said. You have a few hours at best. I don't know how clean Halveth's provincial network is in this area, but if Breswick is communicating your general direction, we're not going anywhere tonight with an infant on open roads in the dark, Kael said. He'd turned from the window. His face had come back to the surface, controlled, cold, organized, the Wolf King face. But Serafina could see, in the set of his jaw and the particular tension around his eyes, that something had changed underneath it. Something had been burned away that wasn't coming back. In the morning, first light, we move. Korvath, you know the interior roads better than I do right now. Where do we go that Breswick can't route Halveth to? Korvath thought for a moment. There's a garrison town called Rath Crossing, 3 hours northeast. The garrison commander there is Colonel Edwin Stahl. She's not connected to any Senate network. She's pure military, old campaign corps. Answers to the field command structure, not the administrative one. If you can reach her with the documentation, she has enough independent authority to— Stahl, Kael said. I know her. She served under my father's second campaign. She's not in Halveth's ledger anywhere, Serafina said. She'd already moved to the document pile, was already checking. Nothing. Her name doesn't appear once. That's either because she's clean, Kael said, or because she's so far outside the network that she was never considered worth converting. Both options make her useful right now, Serafina said. He looked at her across the table. That look again. The one that wasn't simple, that had too much history in it to be just tactical. Rath Crossing, he said. First light. He looked at Korvath. You stay. I need everything you have on Breswick's communication methods. How he's routing information to Halveth, what channels, what timing. If we're going to move before he knows we've moved, I need to understand the window. Korvath nodded and sat down at the table. Serafina went to the back room to sit with the child and let Mare sleep, and she sat in the dark with the infant's warm weight in her arms and the sound of Kael's voice low and precise through the wall, and she thought about Breswick's mechanical bow, and about the envelope placed precisely in the center of her writing desk, and about how the most effective betrayals were the ones you built into the architecture of ordinary days so thoroughly that they became invisible. She had known something was wrong in the palace. She'd felt it in the texture of how information moved, the slight delays, the way certain conversations seemed to generate responses from the wrong people. She had not known to name it Breswick. Neither had Kael. The difference was she'd stopped trusting the architecture and started building her own. He'd trusted it until it delivered him to a cliff in Caspienne with a signed divorce paper and a network of compromised contacts. She looked at the child. He was awake, doing the quiet, purposeful staring of an infant taking inventory of the dark. We're going to be fine, she told him. It was the first time she'd said those words out loud since she'd left the capital. She hadn't let herself say them before because saying them was a commitment. And commitments under uncertainty were a kind of arrogance she couldn't afford. She said them now anyway. Into the dark. To a 6-week-old who couldn't understand them. The child stared back at her with his father's absolute, unintimidated eyes. They were ready to move at first light. The cart, Eden, Mare and the child, Serafina, Kael, Korvath. A small party moving northeast on the back roads toward Rath Crossing with the sun barely breaking the horizon and the morning cold enough to see breath. Kael rode alongside the cart rather than on the bench. He'd been quiet since the night's work with Korvath, the kind of quiet that meant the information had been fully absorbed, and what was left was purely forward motion. He had the documents in a sealed case under the cart's floorboard. He had his knife and a short sword he'd sourced from the Milltown's farrier at a price that hadn't invited questions. He had, Serafina thought, watching him from the cart bench, reorganized himself overnight. She'd watched men do that before. Her father. Before his last Senate campaign. The morning of a difficult session, stripping everything down to what was functional and leaving the rest behind. But Kael's reorganization felt different in quality. Deeper. As if it wasn't just tactical reorientation, but something more fundamental, some calcification that had been holding his center of gravity in a fixed place for 22 years and had now, silently, without ceremony, let go. He glanced at her and found her watching him. Neither of them looked away for a moment. What? He said. Nothing. You're thinking something. I'm always thinking something. She turned forward. Focus on the road. 2 hours from Rath Crossing, Corvath's horse came up alongside her suddenly, and his face had the tight, contained look of a man reading the landscape wrong. The road, he said quietly. That post marker, it was repositioned. Kale was already looking. Serafina looked too. A wooden post marker at the road fork, indicating the northeastern route. It was upright, planted, indistinguishable from 100 other postmarkers. How do you know? Kale said. I've used this road before. The marker should be on the left side of the fork, not the right. Someone moved it. Corvath's eyes were moving across the tree line. This is a redirect. The right fork doesn't go to Rath Crossing. It goes into the Cresswind Valley, which is a dead end against the river. The trees on both sides of the fork were dense, morning dark, even with the sun up, the kind of density that held people easily. Kyle had already pulled his horse to a stop. Serafina looked at the tree line on the right side, then the left. Then she said, very quietly, Eden, stop the cart. Eden stopped. The morning was very quiet. Then she heard it, barely audible, the sound that outdoor silence makes when it's not quite empty, the slight shift of weight on ground cover, the breath pattern of something waiting. They were on both sides. They had been waiting at this fork, which meant they knew the route to Rath Crossing, which meant Breswick had provided it, which meant Corvath's window estimate had been wrong or Halveth's provincial network was faster than any of them had calculated. Kale turned his horse to face the tree line. In the cart, behind Serafina, Marit pulled the child close and said nothing. The tree line opened. Not 5 men this time. Not a small tactical party. 12. Mounted, most of them, arranged in a half circle that closed off the road behind and both forks ahead. And at the center of the formation, on a gray horse with the unhurried posture of a man who had been completely certain this moment was coming, Senator Halveth. He looked older than his official portraits. 70s, lean and dry as old timber, with a face that had spent decades performing reasonableness, and now, here, on a dirt road in the interior provinces with 12 mounted men behind him, didn't need to perform anything. Lord Dravenor, he said, you've led us on a remarkable route. Kale said nothing. I'll keep this direct, Halveth said. You have documentation that represents a significant administrative inconvenience. I'd like it returned. In exchange, I'm prepared to offer Lady Valicrest and the child safe passage to whatever provincial location she prefers. Your situation, unfortunately, requires a different resolution. Serafina felt the words land. She kept her face still. Your situation requires a different resolution. There's a warrant, Halveth continued, in the same mild, reasonable tone. Conspiracy against imperial governance. Subversion of Senate authority. It was drafted last night and signed this morning by the chief judicial officer. He paused. You understand the unfortunate position this places me in. I understand the position you've placed yourself in, Kyle said. I've placed myself at the head of an empire, Halveth said. The position is comfortable. Not for much longer. Halveth smiled. Not with warmth, with the specific, tired patience of a man who had heard variations of that sentence from many people over many years. Lord Dravenor, I've been building this for 12 years. Your father was the original obstacle. You were the continuation. I'm not accustomed to being told my timeline is at risk by men who've been outmaneuvered at every turn. The 12 mounted men held their positions. Kyle's horse shifted under him. He steadied it without looking down. And Serafina watching him from the cart, watching the set of his jaw and the stillness of his hands, and the 12 men arranged in a half circle, and the senator on his gray horse with his warrant and his 12 years and his certainty. Serafina reached into the document case beneath the cart's bench, which she had moved there quietly in the last 5 minutes, and she pulled out a single sealed letter. Senator Halveth, she said. He looked at her with the polite, dismissive attention of a man who doesn't consider women to be variables in the equations that matter. That document was copied, she said. The full package. 3 separate copies. They were sent from Caspienne before I left, routed through contacts your network has no record of, addressed to 3 individuals who have been waiting for a confirmation of my continued survival before they act on the contents. She held up the sealed letter. This is the 4th copy. It's addressed to the editor of the Imperial Tribune. I've been holding it as insurance. If I send it, the story runs in 2 days. Halveth's expression did not change, but something around his eyes shifted. A microscopic adjustment, the tell of a man recalculating. You're bluffing, he said. I have 6 weeks of operational time in Caspian, a network you didn't know existed, and a child who gave me every reason in the world to be thorough. She met his eyes. Test me. The road was very quiet. 12 mounted men, a senator with a warrant, a cart with an infant. 2 people who, between them, had everything left to lose and had stopped treating that as a weakness. Halveth looked at Kael. Kael looked back at him with the expression of a man who has just watched something fundamental shift and is, for the first time in this entire sequence of days and catastrophes and revelations, not the one who shifted it. This changes nothing structurally, Halveth said, but the mild, certain tone had a new texture in it. Not fear, not yet, but the first intimation that the ground he'd been standing on was not as solid as the 12 years had made it feel. It changes everything, Serafina said, because you can't arrest us without triggering the release, and you can't let us go without losing the only window you have to suppress the documentation before it's public, which means you're sitting on a road in the interior provinces at dawn and you've run out of clean options. She looked at him steadily. So have we, she said, which means we're going to have to become different people than either of us plan to be, starting right now. Halveth's gray horse moved under him. The 12 mounted men looked at their senator. And Kyle Dravenor, the Wolf King, who had built 22 years on the premise that sufficient force applied with sufficient clarity was always the answer, looked at Serafina, at the letter in her hand and the steadiness of her voice, and the 6 weeks of patient, meticulous, lonely work that had brought them to this exact moment. And he understood, with the particular finality of a thing that cannot be untrue once it's been true, that the war he'd been fighting his whole life was not the war that mattered. What do we do? He said to her, quietly. Just to her. She looked at him. We stop running, she said, and we take it public. Fiction disclaimer. All characters, events, and locations in this story are entirely fictional and created solely for artistic and entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real persons, living or deceased, or actual events is purely coincidental. Fiction disclaimer. This is a work of 100% original fiction created for artistic and entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and locations are entirely imaginary. Any resemblance to real persons or events is purely coincidental. Nobody moved for 4 seconds. That was how long it took Halveth to decide whether Serafina was bluffing, and in those 4 seconds, Kael watched the senator's face with the total attention of a man who had spent 2 decades reading the moment before a decision broke. The micro-adjustments, the weight shifting, the eyes doing their private calculation. He'd watched generals do it. He'd watched senators do it. He knew what it looked like when a man found the edge of his certainty and had to decide whether to step back or push forward. Halveth stepped back. Not physically. He sat perfectly still on his gray horse, but something in his posture made the decision before his mouth did, and Kyle saw it clearly. Escort them to the garrison road, Halveth said to the man on his right. His voice was still level, still performing the mild, institutional reasonableness he'd worn his whole career. Let them pass. The formation opened on the left fork. This isn't finished, Halveth said, looking at Kael. No, Kael said, it isn't. He didn't look at Halveth again. He turned his horse to the left fork and they moved, the cart and Korvath and Eden, through the gap in the formation, and Kael kept his back straight and his pace controlled because the one thing you never did when walking away from a man with 12 armed riders was move fast enough to look like you were running. He felt Halveth's eyes on his back for a quarter mile. Then the road curved, the tree line thickened, and the fork disappeared behind them. Serafina exhaled. That won't hold him long, Korvath said. It doesn't need to hold him long, Serafina said. It needs to hold him 48 hours. Explain, Kael said. The 3 copies I mentioned, those are real. They went from Caspian before I left, through a routing chain Halveth has no record of. 2 of the recipients are my father's old contacts in the Eastern Coalition, who are clean. I verified them personally before I sent. The 3rd is a Tribune correspondent named Wellamast, who covered the provincial courts for 12 years and has been waiting for documentation on Senate corruption since before my father left office. Serafina's voice was steady, precise, the voice of someone reciting a plan they'd been living inside for weeks. I told them to wait for a confirmation signal. No signal in 30 days means I'm dead, and they publish immediately. A specific signal means hold for direct contact. You set a dead drop trigger. I set 3. Kale looked at her. The cart moved beneath them, the morning air cold against his face. When did you do all this? He said. The second week in Caspienne. She looked ahead at the road. I had a lot of time to think about what would happen when someone eventually came for me. He processed that. The second week. While she was still in the early weeks after childbirth, alone on a cliff above the sea, she had been building an intelligence network with 3 redundant dead drop triggers and a Tribune contact, because she had assessed the situation with clear eyes and prepared for every version of how it could go wrong. He had 22 years of military experience, and she had outprepared him from a cliff house with a 6-week-old and a partial document set. He decided the only appropriate response to that was to never waste her again. Rath Crossing, he said. We still need Stahl. We need her more now than we did an hour ago, Serafina said. Halveth let us go because of the Tribune threat, but he's going to move fast. He'll accelerate whatever timeline he has for consolidating the capital before the story breaks. If we can get Stahl to move her garrison toward the capital and make contact with your loyal generals, we cut off his military option before he can exercise it. Yes. And the documentation goes public simultaneously. Yes. Kyle looked at the road ahead. 48 hours, she'd said. In 48 hours, the architecture of 12 years of patient, invisible work by Halveth's block would either be fully exposed and broken, or it would complete its final move and consolidate everything that was left of the Empire's administrative structure under Senate control. He'd fought campaigns with worse odds. He'd never fought one where the stakes were this specific. Bog. Colonel Edwin Stahl was a compact, gray-haired woman of about 60, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something permanent by 30 years of field command. Not hard exactly, but set, like stone that had been worked and had found its final shape. She received them in her garrison's command room inside Rath Crossing, looked at Kyle for a long moment with the expression of a woman accessing a very old file, and then looked at the documents Korvath laid on her table. She read for 20 minutes without speaking. When she looked up, she looked at Serafina first. These are verified, she said. The routing confirmations are original, Serafina said. The financial ledger is partial but cross-referenced with 3 independent sources. The Bureau Communications. I can walk you through the authentication markers. Stahl looked back at the documents. She turned one page, then another, with the slow, deliberate movement of someone making sure their mind had actually processed what their eyes were reading. Breswick, she said. 4 years confirmed, Korvath said. Possibly longer. I gave that man my garrison inspection reports, Stahl said. Quiet, almost to herself. Every 6 months, through the standard administrative channel, directly to Breswick's office for routing to the Duke's desk. She looked at Kyle. Halveth has had my operational data for 4 years. I know, Kyle said. He knows my troop numbers, my supply lines, my weak points. I know. Something shifted in Stahl's expression. The specific, dangerous calm of a military mind that has just converted outrage into operational fuel. What do you need? She said. I need your garrison moving toward the capital in 6 hours, Kyle said. Not as an invasion, as a protective escort for a duke returning to his seat to address a formal Senate corruption case. By the book. Every protocol correct. I want Halveth looking at your column on the road and finding nothing he can legally intercept. My garrison is 400. I have 3 generals in the capital whose loyalty I'd stake my life on. Combined with your 400 and the documentation going public through the Tribune, you're betting everything on the timing holding, Stahl said. Yes. She looked at him for a moment, then she stood up. I'll have the column ready in 5 hours. I can do better than 6. She moved toward the door, then stopped. Lord Dravenor, your father reviewed my field commission when I was 28 years old. He told me the Empire was worth the cost of defending it. She paused. I'd like to believe he was right. She left to prepare her garrison. Oh, the road to the capital took 14 hours at garrison march pace, which was faster than it sounded. Kyle rode at the column's head and felt the particular, almost physical sensation of a situation in motion. All the pieces committed, all the contingencies accounted for as well as they could be. The variables reduced to the ones you couldn't control and had to trust. He'd felt this before, going into campaigns. The moment after the order was given and before the engagement began, when the outcome was no longer theoretical, but the result wasn't yet real. He'd never felt it about something that wasn't military. This was military partly, 400 soldiers and 3 generals and a garrison colonel moving on a capital. But it was also a Tribune correspondent named Wella Mast somewhere in the city, sitting on a story that was going to detonate what was left of the Senate block's credibility the moment it ran. It was Serafina's 3 dead drops and her 6 weeks on a cliff, and the letter she'd held up on the road with the steady hands that he'd first noticed when she'd signed the divorce papers. He rode 14 hours, and he thought about steady hands. He thought about what it meant that the 2 times he'd seen her hand shake, really shake, not the controlled tremor of someone managing emotion, but the involuntary physical admission of genuine fear, were both times that involved the child, not the 5 men on the cliff, not Halveth's formation on the road. The child. He thought about the fact that he had looked at his son's face for approximately 4 seconds before the fight on the cliff, and had not yet had a single uninterrupted moment since then to simply be in the same space as him without a crisis in immediate progress. He thought about what he intended to do about that when this was over. The capital's outer lights appeared on the horizon at the 14th hour, and Kael put everything else away. The Imperial Senate chamber was a vast, cold hall of pale stone, built to make the people inside it feel appropriately small relative to the power being exercised. It had been designed by an architect who understood intimidation as an aesthetic principle: high ceilings, narrow windows, a floor of white marble that carried footsteps as declarations. The Senate convened in a horseshoe formation, the presiding chair at the open end, and everything about the room was oriented toward the performance of authority. Halveth had called an emergency session. Kael found out about it from a courier Korvath had placed inside the capital 2 days before, a young man who'd been waiting at the East Road checkpoint with a sealed note and the expression of someone who'd been told to deliver it regardless of what was happening around him. The note said, "Emergency session convened. Warrant to be formalized. Tribune correspondent detained this morning." That last line hit hard. Serafina read it over his shoulder. Her face went still in the specific way it went still when she was processing something that required immediate recalculation. "Mast," she said. "The detention won't hold if there's no formal charge," Korvath said, "but it delays the story." "How long?" Kael said. "Hours. Maybe less if she got word out before she was detained." "Then we don't wait for the story to break first," Serafina said. "We go directly into the session, in person, with the documentation." Kael looked at her. "Halveth called the session to formalize the warrant," she continued, "which means every Senate member who isn't part of his bloc is in that room right now, present and required to witness whatever he does next. If we walk into that chamber while the session is live, he can't move against us in front of the full Senate without triggering exactly the institutional scrutiny he's been avoiding," Kael said. "And we put the documentation directly into the record before he can suppress it." Stahl, standing at Kael's right, said, "I can have 50 soldiers at the Senate chamber entrance in 20 minutes. 50 visible soldiers at the Senate entrance is a provocation he can use," Kael said. "It gives him the narrative he wants. Military intimidation of the civilian body." He thought for a moment. Four soldiers in standard escort formation. Everything else stays at the garrison perimeter, visible but not aggressive." Stahl nodded. "The documents," Serafina said. "Split them," Kael said. "Half with me, half with Korvath, who stays outside the chamber. If anything happens to me inside..." "Nothing is going to happen to you inside a full Senate session in front of every witness in the Empire," Serafina said. "Half with Korvath," he said again. Not debating it. She heard the tone and didn't push back. They moved. What? The Senate chamber doors were heavy iron-banded oak, attended by 2 ceremonial guards who were very surprised to see the Wolf King of Varamont arrive with a garrison escort and a sealed document case at the 9th hour of the evening. Kael didn't wait for them to process their surprise. He pushed the doors open himself. The chamber was full, every seat in the horseshoe occupied, the air thick with the particular tension of a session that had been running long and had arrived somewhere uncomfortable. At the presiding position, Halveth stood with papers in his hand, and the expression of a man in the middle of a performance who had just looked up to find the audience had changed. 400 pairs of eyes went to the doors. Kael walked in. He walked the white marble floor in the silence that his entrance had created, feeling it under his boots with each step, and he felt something clarify in him with each step. Not anger, not the hot particular fury of a man wronged, but something colder and more permanent. The understanding that the man walking this floor was not the same man who had handed over divorce papers in a thunderstorm. That man had believed the empire was the thing worth protecting, that the system was the structure that gave his power meaning. The man walking this floor now knew the system had been rotten at its core for years, and that the thing worth protecting had been waiting on a cliff in Caspienne, and he had left it there alone for 6 weeks. You don't become dangerous when you have everything, he thought. You become dangerous when you've already lost it once, and you know exactly what losing it cost. He stopped in the center of the floor. "Senator Halveth," he said, his voice carried to every corner of the chamber without effort. "I have a matter to bring before the full Senate." Halveth set his papers down with the controlled deliberateness of a man who had been caught in the middle of something and needed a moment to decide which version of himself to deploy. "Lord Dravenor," he said. "There is a warrant. There is documentation," Kael said. He held up the sealed case. 4 years of Bureau communications, financial records, and correspondence establishing a systematic operation to subvert imperial governance conducted by members of the Senate. I'm entering it into the formal record now in front of every member present in open session. The chamber made a sound, not quite a murmur, something lower than that. The collective intake of breath of 200 people understanding simultaneously that the thing they were witnessing was not a procedural matter. "This session is not the appropriate venue," Halveth started. "This session is the only appropriate venue." Kael moved toward the record table at the chamber's right side, where a clerk sat frozen with his stylus in his hand. "Every member present is a witness. The record is open. The documentation goes in now, or I take it directly to the Tribune, which is where it's going regardless." Lord Dravenor is operating under a formal warrant, produced by a chief judicial officer whose appointment was funded through Halveth's financial network. Kael set the case on the record table. He looked at the clerk. "Open the formal record." The clerk looked at Halveth. Then he looked at the full Senate. Then he opened the record. The scratch of the stylus on paper was the loudest thing in the chamber. Halveth's face had been doing extraordinary work for the last 3 minutes, maintaining the performance of institutional authority over whatever was happening underneath it. But something was slipping. Kael could see it the way he could see a battle line beginning to break. Not the break itself, but the moment before, when the men in the line started looking at each other instead of forward. 3 senators in the horseshoe had already moved, standing, leaning toward their neighbors, the body language of people repositioning relative to a situation that had changed. "The documentation names specific members of this body," Kael said to the chamber. He kept his voice level, not performing outrage, just delivering fact. "It names financial transfers. It names the fabricated evidence used to dissolve my marriage and remove a source of intelligence from this palace. It names Breswick, who has been Halveth's inside man in my household for 4 years. He paused. "And it names the private militia that has been funded and assembled over 14 months in the provinces south of the capital, which is not a defensive force." That last sentence went through the chamber like a change in atmospheric pressure. A militia. Not a political operation, not administrative maneuvering, a militia. "These are fabrications." Halveth's voice had found a harder register, the performance of reasonableness finally giving way to something underneath it. "They're documented," Kael said. "Every page. The clerk has them now." Halveth looked at the record table. He looked at Kael, and then he looked at something behind Kael, toward the chamber doors, and his expression did something that Kael had not seen on the senator's face in any of their exchanges. Something that was, beneath the thin remaining surface of institutional composure, recognizable as the expression of a man watching his architecture fall. Kael did not turn around. He didn't need to. He knew, from the change in the chamber's collective attention, that Seraphina had walked through the doors. He'd told her to stay at the garrison perimeter. He'd been explicit about it. He heard her footsteps on the white marble, her particular pace, the one he'd learned across 2 years of shared corridors and mornings, crossing the chamber floor. She stopped beside him. He looked at her. She was carrying the second document bundle, the material Korvath had been holding outside. Her face was composed, her posture straight, and she was looking at Halveth with the expression of a woman who had spent 6 weeks on a cliff, deciding exactly what she would do when she found herself standing in this room. "You detained Welamass this morning," she said to Halveth. addressed directly to him in the full Senate chamber in the open record, which means you knew the Tribune had the story, which means you've known the shape of this documentation for at least 48 hours. She set the second bundle on the record table. This is the copy you didn't find. The chamber was very quiet. Everything in both bundles is now in the open Senate record, she said, formally witnessed. Every member present is a legal witness to the entry. You can't suppress it without suppressing the entire Senate record, which requires a majority vote that... She looked at the horseshoe formation, at the faces of men and women who were doing rapid, visible recalculations of where they stood. I don't believe you have tonight. Halveth looked at her. For the first time in all of their exchanges, on the cliff, on the road, in the implicit architecture of everything he'd built around her removal, he looked at her with something other than dismissal. He looked at her the way you look at something you underestimated so completely that the underestimation itself tells you something about your own limits. Take them, he said. The words were quiet, directed at someone in the chamber. And before Kyle had fully processed what was happening, movement erupted from the left side of the horseshoe. Not senators, but men who had been seated as aides, as staff, as the invisible institutional furniture of the chamber, and who were now moving with the specific coordinated purpose of people who had been waiting for exactly this order. Not 12 this time. More. And from inside his coat, the closest one, close enough that Kyle could see the deliberate calm in the man's face, raised something that caught the chamber's cold light and leveled it across 20 feet of white marble floor directly at Serafina. Kyle moved. He didn't think it. There was no space in that half-second for anything that qualified as thought. No tactical assessment, no calculated risk, no version of the decision that passed through the part of his brain that weighed outcomes. His body simply moved the way bodies move when something has been decided at a level below conscious choice. He stepped in front of her. The sound the chamber made when it fired was enormous in the stone space. The impact hit him in the left side, high, below the shoulder, and it was not the way pain usually arrived, not sharp, not immediate, but vast and structural, like being hit by something that rearranged the architecture of how he was standing. He felt his knees make a decision he hadn't authorized, and the white marble came up to meet him, and he was down on one hand and one knee with the cold floor against his palm, and the sound of the chamber completely broken into chaos. He heard Serafina say his name. Not a scream. His name, exactly once, in a voice that had nothing left in it that was managed or controlled. He looked up at her. She was kneeling in front of him, her hands on his face, and behind her the chamber had erupted. Senators on their feet, Stahl's 4 soldiers at the door now moving fast and hard toward the men who'd fired. Voices everywhere, and somewhere in the chaos the sound of more boots on the marble coming from outside, which meant Stahl had made the call to bring the column in, regardless of what he'd told her, which was correct, which was the right call. He would tell her that later. I'm upright, he said to Serafina. His voice came out rougher than he intended. You're on the floor, she said. I'm mostly upright. Kyle, the documentation, he said. Is it in the record? She stared at him. Is it in the record? He said again. Yes, she said. It's in the record. Then it's done. He looked at her face, close to his, her hands still on either side of his jaw, and he thought, in the broken, slightly unreal clarity that pain at this level sometimes produces, he thought that the last time he'd been this close to her face, he'd been handing her the end of something. It's done. Stop talking, she said. Her voice was not steady anymore. Behind her, the chamber was still in motion. Halveth backing toward the presiding chair, 3 senators physically blocking his exit, Stahl's column flooding the doors, the arrested men on the floor, the clerk still seated at the record table with both hands flat on the document bundles, as if his weight alone could anchor them to the world. And Kyle, on the cold white marble of the Imperial Senate chamber with his blood on the stone and Serafina's hands on his face, understood, with the specific, bone-level certainty of a man who has run out of everything except what's true, that the empire he'd spent 22 years defending was not the thing he'd been willing to die for. It never had been. Stay with me, Serafina said. Her voice was the last thing he heard before the chamber's light went sideways, and the marble came all the way up. Fiction disclaimer. All characters, events, and locations in this story are entirely fictional and created solely for artistic and entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real persons, living or deceased, or actual events is purely coincidental. Fiction disclaimer. This is a work of 100% original fiction created for artistic and entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and locations are entirely imaginary. Any resemblance to real persons or events is purely coincidental. He came back to consciousness in pieces. The first piece was pain, not sharp anymore, but settled, installed, the kind that has made itself at home in the body and intends to stay a while. The second piece was ceiling, pale stone, high, unfamiliar. The third piece was sound, low voices somewhere to his left, the particular quality of people speaking carefully because someone nearby needed quiet. The fourth piece was a hand holding his. He didn't move right away. He lay still and let the pieces assemble themselves, and he felt the hand, small, specific, the particular grip of someone who had fallen asleep holding on and hadn't let go even in sleep. He knew the hand without looking. He'd known it across 2 years of dinners and corridors and one thunderstorm night when it had taken papers from him with a steadiness he hadn't deserved. He turned his head. Serafina was asleep in the chair beside the bed, her body angled toward him with the unconscious fidelity of someone who'd been keeping watch for a long time and had finally lost the fight against exhaustion. Her hair was loose. There were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there on the cliff in Caspian, or maybe they had been and he hadn't been looking carefully enough. He was looking carefully now. He looked at her face for a long time, long enough to actually see it rather than process it. The line of her jaw, the small scar at her temple from a childhood fall she'd mentioned once, and he'd filed and never asked about again. The way her breathing had the deep, total quality of someone who had been running on insufficient sleep for weeks, and had finally, in this chair, in this room, let the body take what it needed. He looked at her and he felt, under the pain and the assembled fragments of the last 72 hours, something that he did not have a military term for, something that had no tactical application. Something that had been in him for longer than he'd admitted and that the last month had stripped every rationalization away from until it sat there plain and undeniable as the stone ceiling. He tightened his hand around hers. She woke up. Not startled, just the eyes opening, finding him immediately, the way you find something you've been keeping track of even in sleep. They looked at each other for a moment without speaking. "What day?" he said. His voice was rough from disuse. "Third day?" she said. "The surgeon said the ball didn't reach anything essential. You lost significant blood, but the wound is clean." She paused. Moret's exact words were that you're too stubborn to die from one shot, which she delivered as a diagnosis. She's probably right. She's definitely right. Serafina straightened in the chair, and he watched her assemble herself back into the waking version, the composed surface coming up, the managed precision returning. But slower than usual. The exhaustion had softened the edges of it, and she let it be softer, which was something she didn't always allow. "Halveth," he said, "in custody, formally." 3 senators from the Old Guard coalition filed the detention order within 2 hours of the chamber incident. They had enough of the documentation read by then to act, and with Stahl's garrison in the building, there was no mechanism for the block to obstruct it. She looked at her hands briefly. Breswick was arrested at the palace the same evening. The chief judicial officer resigned before he could be formally charged, and is cooperating with the investigation in exchange for terms. The militia. Stahl took 2 detachments south the morning after the Senate session. The militia's command structure folded when they got word Halveth was in custody. Apparently the loyalty was contractual rather than ideological. Most of them dispersed. The leadership is being processed. Kyle took that in. The shape of it. The architecture of 12 years of patient construction, dismantled in 72 hours because the documentation had been in the open record, and the witnesses had been present, and the machinery of it had depended, at its core, on nobody being willing to walk into the room and say the thing plainly. Serafina had walked into that room. "I told you to stay at the perimeter," he said. She looked at him. "I know. I was explicit about it. You were." She held his gaze with the particular steadiness he'd come to understand was not stubbornness, but something more considered, the look of a woman who had made a decision she'd examined from every angle and was prepared to account for. Mast had been detained. The first document bundle was in the record, but not the second. If I stayed at the perimeter and something went wrong inside that chamber, half the documentation was still suppressible. She paused. I made the call that the documentation mattered more than the perimeter instruction. You walked into a chamber where Halveth had armed men positioned. Yes. You could have been... Yes. She didn't look away. I know what I walked into. I walked into it anyway. He looked at her, the ceiling, his own hand around hers. Don't do it again, he said. Something moved through her expression. Something that was almost a smile but carried too much weight to be just that. I'll take it under advisement. He let that stand because arguing it required energy he didn't have, and because she was right, which was a thing he was going to have to get more comfortable acknowledging. The child, he said, with Mairead, 2 rooms down. She watched him. He's fine. He's been fine. He sleeps better than you do. I'd like to... He stopped, tested whether his body had an opinion about moving, and received a comprehensive response in the negative. When you can sit up, she said, I'll bring him to you. He nodded. He lay still for a moment with the pain and the ceiling in her hand. Serafina, he said. Don't, she said quietly. Not yet. You've been shot. The accounting can wait until you're not horizontal. I've been waiting to say it since the road outside Caspian. She was quiet. I looked at you signing those papers, he said, and I told myself I was protecting the Empire. I told myself the decision was rational and strategic, and that sentiment was a liability a duke couldn't afford. He felt the words come out roughly, without the smooth architecture of a prepared speech, which was the only way they were going to come out honest. I had 22 years of evidence that I was right about that. I had a whole career built on the premise that what you feel is less reliable than what you calculate. He paused. I was wrong about almost everything. The room was quiet. Down the hall somewhere, a door opened and closed. You weren't wrong about everything, she said. Name something I got right. You got on a horse and rode 11 days. She looked at his hand in hers. You didn't send a letter. You didn't send a representative. You came yourself, alone, without an escort, to a cliff in a province nobody cares about because... She stopped. Because I couldn't calculate my way to an outcome that didn't require seeing you, he said. She looked up at him. That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me, she said. I'm working on a new approach, he said. It's slower. I don't recommend it. She made a sound that was unmistakably a short and genuine laugh. Not the social laugh of Senate dinners, but the real one. The one he'd heard maybe 6 times in 2 years, and had filed each time as something rare and worth cataloging. He held on to the sound of it. He was sitting up by the 5th day, which the surgeon described as ahead of schedule, and Mairead described as predictable given his particular brand of willful physical stubbornness. And Serafina brought the child to the room in the morning. She set him in Kael's arms with the careful, precise transfer of a woman who had become expert at the logistics of handing a small person to someone who didn't know yet how to hold one. Kael looked down at his son. Kael Eden Valicrest looked back up at him with the dark, serious eyes that had stopped everything on the cliff, and the absolute, unintimidated attention of someone who had not yet learned that the world was supposed to be impressive. He was small. That was the thing that kept landing. The specific, almost incomprehensible smallness of him, the weight of him in Kael's arms, which was nothing like the weight of anything he'd ever held before. Not light, exactly. Dense, rather. Compact with aliveness. Kael sat with him for a long time. He didn't try to say anything. There was nothing to say that the child could understand, and the things worth saying didn't require language anyway. They required the sustained presence of a man who had spent his whole career moving fast toward the next objective, sitting still for once, holding what was actually his, feeling the specific gravity of it. Serafina sat at the window and let him have it. He looked over at her at some point. He didn't know how long they'd been in the room together. The child had gone to sleep against his shoulder somewhere in there, and she was watching him with an expression that was open in a way her expressions rarely were. Unguarded, the composed surface down. He has your jaw, she said. I noticed. It's going to be a problem when he's older. Probably. He looked back at the child's sleeping face. The name. What about it? Kael Eden Dravenor, he said. He said it without preamble, without negotiating the approach, just putting the words in the room. When you're ready. If you're ready. There's no timeline. Kael. I know it's not a simple... Kael. She waited until he looked at her. Ask me properly. He looked at her. He understood what she was asking him to do and why, and he understood that it was going to require something from him that his entire formation as a duke and a military commander and the Wolf King of Veramont had specifically not developed, The ability to ask for something without the armor of calculation around it. Just the ask, plain, with all its vulnerability showing. He looked at her across the room with his son asleep on his shoulder. "Come home," he said. "Both of you. Come home because I want you there. Not because it's strategic, not because of the child's name, or the political situation, or any reason that fits into a war room. Come home because the palace is empty without you, and I have been living in a version of my life that I don't want anymore, and I don't know how to build the other version without you in it." He paused. "That's the true thing. That's what I should have said in the chamber during a thunderstorm 2 months ago, instead of talking about optics." Serafina looked at him for a long moment. Outside the window, the capital's morning was moving. Distant sounds of the city, the ordinary machinery of people and streets, and the empire's daily life, which had continued its business through coups and Senate corruption, and a duke getting shot on a marble floor, because life is constitutionally indifferent to the crises happening inside it. "The palace has to change," she said. "Yes. Not cosmetically, the way it functions, who has access to information, how decisions move, what the administrative structure looks like when Breswick's entire operation is gone. I know, I need your help rebuilding it. I'm not an administrative resource." "I know that too." He held her gaze. "I need your help because you see things I miss, and you always have, and I spent 2 years treating that like a peripheral feature instead of the point." He paused. "I'm done missing the point." She was quiet for a moment. "The name can change," she said finally. "When we're home. When it feels right." She looked at the sleeping child. "Not as a formality. As a real thing." "As a real thing," he said. She looked back at him. "All right," she said. 2 words. Not a ceremony, not a performance, just the plain, weighted agreement of a woman who had assessed the situation with clear eyes and made a decision she intended to keep. He exhaled. 1. They returned to Dravenor Palace on the 20th day, when Kael could ride without the wound pulling, and when Stahl's report on the Southern militia had cleared, and when the Senate investigation had progressed far enough that the block's remaining infrastructure was functionally dismantled. The palace looked different. That was his first thought, riding through the main gate with Serafina beside him and Edon's cart behind them. It looked different, and then he understood that it didn't. The stone was the same, the towers were the same, the courtyard was the same, but he was looking at it differently. The eyes that had ridden out of this gate 2 months ago, carrying 22 years of certainty like a uniform, were not the eyes looking at it now. The staff had turned out in the courtyard, not ceremonially. There were no formal lines, no prepared reception. Just the people who worked in the palace, gathered with the particular quality of people who had been through something difficult and were relieved that a specific face had come back through the gate. Marae had opinions about the state of the herb garden, which she delivered to the head groundskeeper within 4 minutes of arrival with the focused authority of a woman returning to a domain that had been mismanaged in her absence. Kael stood in the main entrance hall. He stood in it for a moment alone before the business of return took over, before the reports and the reconstruction work and the long, careful process of building something new out of what had been broken. He stood in the hall where he had walked 1,000 times without really seeing it, and he looked at what he'd built here. Power. Yes. A great deal of power, accumulated and defended and displayed in every proportion of the architecture. An empire's administrative center. A military command hub. A seat of authority that had been slowly hollowed out from the inside while he looked outward, because he had not understood that the threats worth fearing don't come from the direction you're armored against. They come from the people in the rooms you take for granted. They come from the ordinary days you move through without paying attention. They come from the moment you hand someone divorce papers and call it strategy. He had built this palace as a fortress and lived in it as a machine, and he had been thoroughly, almost fatally wrong about what a life built only on power eventually became. Not strong, not permanent, just cold. Cold and hollow, and waiting for the moment when someone with patience and a fabricated letter decided it was time to take it apart. He heard Serafina's footsteps behind him. She came to stand beside him, the child in her arms, looking at the same hall he was looking at. "It needs light," she said. "Yes." "The east wing can open to the garden properly if you take out the interior wall between the corridor and the south gallery. Structurally, it's not—" "Do it," he said. She looked at him. "Whatever you want to change," he said. "Do it. This is your house." She looked back at the hall. He could see her looking at it the way she looked at the documents in Caspian, assessing, planning, seeing the architecture of what it could become rather than what it was. "There are going to be difficult days," she said. "Yes." "I'm not talking about the political reconstruction. I mean us. There are things between us that aren't resolved by a conversation in a recovery room and a ride through a gate. There's going to be—" "I know," he said. "I'm not expecting resolution. I'm expecting the work." She looked at him. "The work. The actual daily work of it. Showing up. Asking instead of deciding. Saying the true thing even when the calculated thing is easier." He paused. "I'm a slow learner on that front, but I'm not going to stop." She considered him for a moment. "That's the most useful thing you've said about this," she said. "I told you I was working on a new approach." She almost smiled. The real one. The weighted one. The child made a sound against her shoulder. The small, declarative sound of someone waking up with an opinion about the quality of the stillness. Kyle reached over. He put his hand on his son's back, felt the small, steady breathing under his palm. The child turned his head and found Kyle's face with those dark, unimpressed eyes, and regarded him with the absolute present-tense attention that infants have before the world teaches them to manage their gaze. He held the look. He thought about what Korvath had said, about Serafina being the only reason Kyle had occasionally listened to counsel that wasn't military. He thought about what it meant that the most effective intelligence operation conducted against the Halveth bloc had been run from a cliff house in Caspian by a woman he'd handed divorce papers to and sent out into the dark alone. He thought about the kind of man who made that mistake. And he thought about the kind of man who, having made it, rode 11 days to find a cliff and a child and a letter held up in the morning air, and understood somewhere in the process that the empire he'd been defending was not the empire worth defending, that the thing worth defending was smaller and warmer and harder to quantify, and infinitely more worth the cost. You don't know what you're built for until the structure you relied on collapses, he thought. You find out what's left when everything conditional has been stripped away. Some men find nothing. Some men find something they didn't know they were carrying. He'd found his son's face on a cliff. He'd found Serafina's steady hands. He was going to spend the rest of his life being worthy of both. Winter came early that year. The first snow fell on Dravenor Palace in the 10th month, lightly, the way first snows do, not committing, just arriving, testing the temperature of the world before deciding to stay. It settled on the courtyard stones and the garden walls and the sill of the window, where Serafina's herbs were growing again, repotted and recovering in the way that living things recover when they're given the right conditions. Kyle stood at the window and watched it come down. The east wing wall was gone, opened to the south gallery the way she'd described, and the light that moved through the palace now was different. The same building, but breathing. Something about the proportions had changed. The place felt, for the first time he could remember, like somewhere a person lived rather than somewhere power was stored. The Senate investigation had concluded 3 weeks prior. Halveth would answer to a judicial process that, without his bloc's captured judiciary, was clean for the first time in a decade. The provincial governors were being reviewed. The bureau was being rebuilt from the ground up under Korvath's oversight. Stahl had been given a formal senior command appointment, delivered through channels that didn't require Kyle to explain why he was grateful, though they both understood. The empire was not fixed. That was going to take years, possibly a generation, and the work of it was going to be slow and unglamorous and full of the specific frustrations of institutional repair. He had accepted that. He had accepted that the man who wanted immediate, decisive, measurable outcomes was not the right man for it, and that the first step in becoming the right man was sitting with the slowness instead of forcing it. He was sitting with a lot of things now. From down the hall, he heard Serafina's voice, low, rhythmic, the particular cadence of someone talking to an infant who is almost but not quite asleep, negotiating the last few minutes of consciousness. He knew the cadence by now. He'd learned the texture of her voice in all the registers he hadn't paid attention to in the first 2 years, the way you stop hearing music that plays constantly until the silence makes you understand what you were living inside. He heard the voice settle, quiet, stop. A few minutes later, she appeared in the doorway. She looked at the snow, then at him. "He's down," she said. "First try?" "Third." She came to stand beside him at the window. "He has your stamina for not yielding to the inevitable." That's a compliment, technically. It wasn't delivered as one. They stood at the window and watched the snow come down on the palace garden, which was sparse and dormant now, but which Serafina had been planning since the first week, sketching layouts at the work table in the evenings with the focused attention she brought to everything she decided to build. Stahl's formal appointment comes through next week, she said. Yes. She'll need a command structure that bypasses the Senate administrative chain. Korvath's draft proposal routes it through the Duke's household seal directly. I reviewed it. It's good. Korvath is good, she said. He's going to be useful for a long time if you keep him close. He's already closer than I expected. He's terrifying with documents. Kael paused. He's afraid of Maret. Everyone is afraid of Maret. Reasonably. The snow came down. The garden absorbed it slowly, the bare branches of the dormant plants holding small collections of white on their upward edges. I've been thinking about what you said, Serafina said. In the recovery room. About the new approach. He waited. I want you to understand that I'm not going to make this easy, she said. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the garden, her voice measured and careful with the specific care of someone who has thought about what they're going to say and wants to say it right. I'm not talking about being difficult for its own sake. I'm talking about the fact that I watched you choose the calculated thing over the true thing for 2 years, and I accommodated it, and I'm not going to accommodate it again. If I see you doing it, with me, with Kael, with the people in this house, I'm going to tell you. Good, he said. I mean it. It won't feel good in the moment. I know. He looked at the side of her face. I want you to. That's not me being gracious about it. I want someone in this house who tells me the true thing before it takes a Senate floor and a gunshot to hear it. She turned to look at him. Her eyes in the snowlight were doing the complicated, private thing that he was learning to simply let be complicated and private rather than trying to decode and categorize. He was learning a lot of things that he should have been learning for years, and the learning was slow and sometimes uncomfortable, and he was not, in the privacy of his own honest assessment, certain he was going to be consistently good at any of it. But he was here, standing at a window with snow coming down outside, and his son asleep down the hall, and this woman beside him who had survived everything the Empire had thrown at her, and had walked into a Senate chamber anyway, and had held his hand for 3 days while he was unconscious without being asked to. He was here, and he was paying attention. That was where you started. Not with the grand gesture or the dramatic declaration or the clean resolution that closed every wound at once. You started by showing up at the window. You started by looking at the person beside you and seeing them, actually seeing them, not the role they played in your plans, but the person, complicated and capable and worth every bit of the sustained, unglamorous work of knowing. Serafina, he said. Thank you. She looked at him. The question was in her expression without words. For coming back, he said. For walking into that chamber. For not making it easy. He paused. For the herbs on the windowsill. She was quiet for a moment. Don't make me cry over herbs, she said. Her voice was not quite steady. I'm being serious. I know you are. She looked back at the garden. That's why I said don't. The snow came down over Dravenor Palace, over the open east wing and the south gallery, and the work table with its sketches, and the window with its herbs, and the room down the hall where a child was sleeping with his father's eyes and his mother's patience, over the courtyard where the carriage had waited on the night that started all of it, over the city that was learning, slowly, what it looked like when the machinery of governance was built to serve rather than to consolidate. It came down without ceremony, the way winter does, the way the real things do. Not announced, not dramatic, just present. Kael put his hand on the window frame. Serafina put her hand over his. The empire that had been built on fear and control was over. The empire that came after it was going to take years and patience and the kind of daily courage that didn't look like courage from the outside. The courage of sitting still, of asking instead of taking, of choosing the true thing over the calculated thing when they diverged. He had been, for 22 years, a man who believed that strength was the absence of need, that the most dangerous thing was to let someone close enough to understand your specific vulnerabilities. He had been wrong in almost every direction it was possible to be wrong. The most dangerous thing was to close the distance and still not see, to have someone in your house, at your table, signing papers in your chamber, and to look through them instead of at them, To have everything and call it enough. He'd called it enough. He knew now what enough actually was. It was here. It was this. Snow on a garden in the first winter of something new. Fiction disclaimer. All characters, events, and locations in this story are entirely fictional and created solely for artistic and entertainment purposes. All scenarios, characters, and narratives are products of creative imagination intended for entertainment only. Any resemblance to real persons, living or deceased, or actual events is purely coincidental. This content is produced for mature audiences as a work of cinematic serialized fiction.